Hi there, friends. Welcome to another video on social science research methodologies. In this demo, I'll explain to you what treatment and control groups are. The approach I use for this demo is a little bit different because I'm using a scenario-based approach to explain what these two groups are. And for scenario one, I painted a trial where an experiment was conducted to test the effectiveness of, let's say, XYZ pain medication. And this experiment involved, of course, a medical trial. And so we have two groups for the medical trial. One of them is the treatment group, and another one is the control group. And these are simply subset or a group of samples are taken from the population and are now subject of our study or trial. So the treatment group was given the actual medication and to test for the actual effect of the pain medication as part of the experiment to see if the pain medication is effective and and its goal of reducing pain. And then the control group is given the placebo medication, which is a substance that's identical to a medication, but it's only used as a control variable for placebo effect. So if there is any effect that are not caused by the actual medication, the placebo effect or the control effect, we should be able to account for those. So as a result, the experimenter analyzes the data that's drawn from the experiment using both experiment and control variables to test whether the new medication is effective in pain management. So in which case, the researcher would conduct a test to see if there's any significant difference between the effectiveness results of the medication between the treatment group and control group. And if the treatment group reported a very low score of a pain score for on their survey, and then the control group reports a higher or any score that's different from the treatment group, then the experimenter can claim that the pain medication is effective or is significantly effective as opposed to control medication or placebo medication. So this scenario involved an experimental methodology where the subject of however the subject of the experiment are humans, but the substance that's used for the experiment is medication. That's why I call it an experimental study. The second scenario I have is involves policy, and of course the people are still the subject of the study, but I call it quasi-experimental because it's really not as scientifically experimental as a medical trial would be. We can also refer to such studies as non-experimental, but because we can apply the same concept, the same framework into to such studies, that's why it's fair to call it a quasi-experimental. And so in this scenario, I painted the occasion where an experiment was conducted to test the effectiveness of a new economic policy in collective prosperity. So to see if that economic policy is effective in producing collective prosperity. So the experiment involved application of a taxation-related economic policy in mainland district. Mainland district is just a name I'm using here for the sake of for the sake of practice. And so the economic policy that the experimenter is introducing as an experiment is it revolves around taxation. And so the policy is implemented on the experiment group and the upper town of the mainland district. So upper town again is just a name I'm using here for sake of practice. So just like the case of scenario one where we had the experiment group receiving the actual medication or actual effect. Same thing with this with scenario two, except that the medication is substituted by the policy. So the policy, this new taxation-based economic policy was implemented on the experiment group that's chosen to be and that's clustered in the upper town of the mainland district. So everybody that lives in the upper town of the mainland district are now part of the treatment group. They are now subject of a treatment study, and that treatment is not medication treatment or any other scientific experiment. Rather, it is an economic policy treatment. And then the other group, the policy was not implemented on the lower town of the Midland District. So the lower town is again another name I'm using here for the sake of practice, and so the people who are living in the lower town of the mainland are the control group, or pretty much they are the people that we would like to compare our the validity of our actual effect based on those people. So they are pretty much the them not receiving the policy acts like the placebo in scenario one, except that they are not given any placebo. Instead, they will not be given that policy. So people living in lower town of the mainland district are like the people in the control group in scenario one who only receive placebo medication, and in this case, they're receiving no policy, or the policy is not implemented in their city, in their town. So that policy not being implemented is like they're receiving a placebo medication, if just for the sake of analogy there. So as a result, the researcher analyzes the data drawn from the experiment using both experiment and control variables. Again, we are looking at the experiment data, but we also accounting or taking into account the control data to test whether the new economic policy is effective in developing a collective prosperity. So as a result, the researcher may conduct a survey to collect information data about how happy the people in the upper town of the mainland district are about the new taxation related economic policies. And the same thing will happen on lower town of the mainland district, where will be asked about how happy they are with the current taxation related economic policies. So the result of these two tests or studies will be compared and will be analyzed to designate the effectiveness of that economic policy. So, a couple of things. If your control groups differ from the treatment groups in ways that you haven't accounted for, your results may reflect the interference of a confounding variable instead of your independent variables. That's very important to know. Also, control groups help ensure the internal validity of your research. You might see a difference over time in your dependent variable in your treatment group. However, without a control group, it's difficult to know whether the change is caused from the treatment. It's possible that the change is due to some other variables. And lastly, some of the key tips that I have about minimizing the risk of invalid control groups is that you should ensure that all of the potential confounding variables are accounted for. Preferably, you can do it through an experimental design if possible, since it may be difficult to control for all of the possible confounding variables outside of an experimental space or environment. Another tip is that for you to use double blinding, and this approach helps you prevent the members of each group from modifying their behavior based on whether they're placed on the treatment or control group. And then lastly, randomly assigning your subjects into control and treatment groups. This will be these three methods and approaches can help you significantly minimize the risk from having invalid control groups. Um, this is it for today. Thank you so much.